Continuing our study of the book of Revelation, we are in chapter 15. Chapter 15 has 8 verses. They serve to introduce the 7 bowls. We have left the last of the insertions, the grape harvest and the throwing of those grapes into the winepress and the trampling of those grapes, so to speak, was the last of the insertions. And now we are, in this chapter again, we are preparing for the 7 bowls. Last in our series, 7 seals. The last seal contains the 7 trumpets. 7 trumpets. The last trumpet contains the last 7 bowls. So we are getting ready for the 7 bowls now. Chapter 15, verse 1. And I saw another great and amazing sign in heaven, 7 angels having the last 7 plagues. They are last because in them the wrath of God is completed. Bowls are not mentioned here, but we know that these 7 angels have 7 bowls full of the last 7 plagues. I've translated, they are last because in them the wrath of God is completed. The words they are last have to be supplied in English translation. They're not there in the Greek, but it's clear that the explanation, because in them the wrath of God is completed, is an explanation of them being last. Again, this is not a restatement of what we already learned in the seals and the trumpets. This is another final set at the end of the 7 years. 7 plagues, 7 bold plagues will be poured out. But this chapter and its 8 verses just gets us ready for those 7 last plagues. Verse 2. And I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who were victorious over the beast, and over his image, and over the number of his name, standing upon the sea of glass, holding zithers from God. In 7:9 through 17, John sees a large group of people who have come out of the Great Tribulation, and they have been victorious over the beast. Only after worship were the 7 trumpets described, and again, worship before the 7 bowls are poured out. There's a pattern here. People who die as martyrs without denying Christ are victorious over the beast. They win. They are winners. They are the Greek expression nikon, which we saw repeated 7 times in chapter 2 and chapter 3, where we were urged to be victorious, to be victors. Even so, victorious over the beast is a specific subcategory. This kind of martyrdom is a subcategory of all the victors of Christ. Not all victors are martyrs, but all martyrs for Christ are victors. These people are victorious in the persecutions of the Antichrist, the beast, in the last 3.5 years, the last 42 months, the last 1,260 days of the 7-year period. So this is a specific group. Morris tells us that in the early days of the church, Morris writes, a man's martyrdom was often called the day of his victory. They knew the book of Revelation. They knew that martyrdom for Christ was victory. They understood this perfectly well. Not all believers are victors, but wow, those that die for Christ are victors. And the church celebrated that. It's a wonderful note from church history from Morris. Even William Barclay writes, the real victory is not to live in safety, to evade trouble, cautiously and prudently to preserve life. The real victory is to face the worst that evil can do, and if need be, to be faithful unto death. Words of William Barclay. Very countercultural. Even in a lot of our Christian culture, we seek comfort. And the Lord is urging us out of comfort, even to be willing to die for our faith. In the book of Revelation, they are here said to be standing upon the sea of glass. Well, the Greek word upon is translated upon is epi. Usually it means upon, but it can mean beside. So we don't really know whether they were standing upon this sea of glass or they were standing beside the sea of glass. It doesn't matter. It's a glorious place in heaven. And again, they were given zithers of God, zithers from God. The Greek here is a genitive of God, but it's a genitive of source, so it's fine to translate it zithers from God. Chapter 15, verse 3. And they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Note the perfectly parallel structure here. Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Very beautiful Hebrew style parallel poetry. Now it does say, we have in English, the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. Well, the word and here is the very, very, very common Greek word kai. Kai usually means and that's how I've translated here. It can also mean that is, even. So it could be translated the song of Moses, the servant of God, even the song of the Lamb, or the song of Moses, the servant of God, that is the song of the Lamb. It could be that it's one song. There are two songs of Moses. One is in Exodus 15 when Moses celebrates the victory over Pharaoh, and another in Deuteronomy 32 when Moses praises God before he died. The song of Moses in Exodus 15 seems to be the basis for this song of Moses here. And it's very fitting. Moses in Exodus 15 celebrates a victory. And here, towards the end of the tribulation, they are celebrating victory. Again, Revelation seems to be a new Exodus, or you might say that the original Exodus out of Egypt is a sort of rehearsal for this real and ultimate Exodus. Chapter 15, verse 4. Who will not fear you, Lord, and glorify your name, because you alone are holy, for all will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. This is a prelude to the final judgments of the bowls. And part of this praise is that all will come, every living creature will be worshiping God. How wonderful this is. Some manuscripts, many manuscripts say all the nations, but apparently the majority, even though many say all the nations, even some old manuscripts, apparently the majority say all instead of all the nations. Verse 5, and after these things I looked, and the temple, the tent of the testimony, was opened in heaven. This verse reminds us that these bowls that we're about to read about come from the temple. Interesting here, it's called the temple, and it's also called the tent of the testimony. These things come from the temple, they come from God. Verse 6, and the 7 angels, having the 7 plagues, came out of the temple, dressed in clean, bright linen, wearing golden sashes around their chests. Note that the text does not say they are wearing white clothing. We imagine that these angels were wearing white clothing, but the text says they are wearing clean, bright linen. Strange, why doesn't it say white? Well, I think the answer to that is because white clothes in the book of Revelation are only mentioned about the victors. It goes back to, they will walk with me dressed in white, back in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Note again, they came out of the temple. These final judgments come from God. Verse 7, and one of the four creatures gave the seven angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. Whenever we see these 4 creatures, they are always closely associated with God. They are never sent, as far as we read, they are never sent off on angelic tasks as messengers. They are always right there with God, indicating again that these 7 bowls of wrath come from God. The Greek word for bowl here is phiale. Sometimes this word is used to describe some of the instruments of temple worship, but also people drank wine out of phiale, out of these bowls in that era. And so perhaps we have a connection with drinking the wine of the wrath of God that we read about in that last insertion, and these 7 bowls. Verse 8, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one was able to enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. In the Old Testament, smoke is often associated with the throne of God. We might look at Exodus 19:18 or Isaiah 6:4. And we see here that no one could enter the temple because of that smoke. Is this because this judgment of God is such a terrible work of God that no one dared enter? We don't know why no one can enter. Thus, chapter 15 prepares us for the pouring out of those 7 bowls. And in chapter 16, we will read about each one of those bowls of wrath being poured out upon the earth.